Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Startup Operators Weekly Roundup. The Weekly Roundup is a show for people who like to stay updated with the latest developments from the Indian startup ecosystem. Last week, after a lot of deliberations, Elon Musk finally was able to acquire Twitter for $44 billion. And closer home, we had Boat, which had initially planned for its IPO later this year, has withdrawn the DRHCP papers. Along with that, we have some really interesting fundraisers which were announced last week. But before diving into all of these headlines, Roshan, how has the week been for you?
Well, I still have a Diwali hangover, I should say.
I mean, your kurta definitely shows.
Yeah, I'm still kind of rocking the ethnic, I would say, right? Yeah. It's an interesting week for sure. I mean, we heard news about the Tata and Airbus collaboration, right? 22,000 crore manufacturing plant supposedly coming up in Vadodara and Gujarat.
Yeah.
So they will be manufacturing C-295 airplanes. And, we've spoken about the Defense Acquisition Council and the new guidelines that they had issued in 2020, 2021, right? In terms of make in India, manufacture in India, build that ecosystem and so on. This is fantastic. I mean, it's a very good development. Oddly enough, at times of a crisis, who do you call? You call an Indian CEO, right? And that's what UK has done now with Rishi Sunak taking over as the Prime Minister. Perhaps at one of the most difficult times in UK's history recently, right? Energy prices are soaring. There's a lot of discontent within the country itself. So let's see how that pans out. But it's another validation for Indian talent.
Yeah, I mean, of course, and maybe in the next US elections as well, we might have two candidates of Indian
Oh
origin.
yeah,
Kamala Harris and Nikki Haley, both who have Indian origins.
yeah.
And then if you look at any of the big, and if you look at all these big tech companies, right, like Microsoft, Twitter, well, until recently, and all of these companies have an Indian leader at the helm, right? And I think it was back in August when Balaji Srinivasan tweeted that the internet will rapidly become much more of an Indian playground, influencing ideas and moods as well as how we write and speak English. The future of intellectual spaces is to the large extent going to be Indian derived.
Absolutely. I mean, so this is another validation for Indian talent, right? I mean, one could argue that, if you look at certain folks, Rishi Sunak, for example, he is British, born and brought up in England. Certainly, India can't claim credit to that. But the guy still has his tradition and culture very much intact, right? I mean, he celebrates Diwali and, all of those things. I think there is something to it. You can't kind of look at it as a coincidence, right? I mean, all of those companies that you mentioned, whether it's Google, Microsoft, Adobe, Twitter, we'll talk about, but the rest of them as well, right? I mean, there is something to it that Indians can sort of thrive in a lot of ambiguity. We can form order in chaos, right? And we're really diligent and hardworking folks, right?
Yeah,
So
I mean,
so it's
apart from
certainly
that,
inspiring, I should say.
yeah, I mean, apart from that, I mean, if you look at one thing which is inherently common to all Indians is that whole ability to do jugaad
Yeah,
and not just rely on big budgets and big things,
yeah,
right?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and okay, talking about Twitter, right? I think the way Elon announced his acquisition, that has to be the. I mean, it has to go down in history, right? He just came, and of course, using Twitter as a platform, he tweeted, "The bird is free."
Yeah.
I mean, like, wow. And the first thing he did after joining Twitter is fire most of the senior execs. The CEO is out, the CFO is out,
Yeah.
and well, I don't know, but have you let that sink in?
Yeah, I mean it's sunk in all right, and all hail Lord Elon. I think nobody could have made a more dramatic entry. I think in the history of mergers and acquisitions, this is perhaps the funniest probably acquisition that's happened ever, right? See, Elon has put his money where his mouth is, right? In some sense, I mean he's paid 3 to 4 times more for Twitter than they're really worth, and in that tweet that he put out, he said that he was doing it for humanity because he really believes that Twitter could be that public square where you can have, free and unfettered conversations, right, about things that really matter to us. Now, I don't know how much of that you believe, and you could be cynical about it. And say that perhaps, I mean, he's done this so that he could protect his own distribution as well, right? I mean, certainly Twitter at 300 or 400 million users, minus the bots, still has a phenomenal reach, right? Better than any of the mainstream media outlets out there. So maybe he's doing it for Tesla and for Starlink and for the other businesses. But maybe, I mean, you can call me naive, but I think he's probably done this for idealistic reasons as well, right? And we're seeing the first signs of that, right? I mean, he spoke about a content moderation council that he will set up and bringing back, banned accounts. I'm certainly looking forward to, Donald Trump being back on Twitter, right? We're going to see a lot of Kofefe or whatever again on the timeline. Very interesting development, I mean, and I look at it as a win-win-win for everyone around. It's a win for Elon. He gets to do what he wants right now with Twitter. Right, it's a win for even the folks who were fired. Parag Agarwal, I mean, I think makes about 40 million or something now as severance. Vijaya Gadde makes, I think, who's the chief of policy who got fired, makes around 40-50 million, and the CFO Ned Sager also makes a similar amount, about 40 million or so. Right, and from our perspective, hey, I mean, we get to again live a very free and unhindered sort of a platform, right? Because I think over the last 1 or 2 years, especially, I think Twitter had gotten really egregious with their very arbitrary and discretionary policies on banning, muting, and stuff, right? I mean, look at some of the channels that we run as well. The tweets are up, the engagement is up, the mentions are up, but the followers are not rising proportionately. Forget about proportionately. I mean, it's almost muted, right?
Right.
And there is little to no recourse for any of the content creators on the platform. One of the folks had tweeted to Elon saying that they should incentivize content creators to put out content on the platform, and he had said that that's a great idea, right? And again, I mean, if you look at it, probably 5% of the folks on the platform create all of the valuable content. 5% is an exaggeration. It's probably 1%, right? And those folks should have an incentive to do that. YouTube has shown what can happen when you incentivize creators, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
man,
they have that whole
YouTube,
creator
Meta.
ecosystem as well.
Yeah.
So definitely, interesting times ahead. I really liked the stunt that those two guys pulled, Mr.
Jonathan.
Rahul Ligma and Mr. Daniel Johnson, right? So I mean,
Yeah,
again,
they troll the entire internet at one go. I
absolutely. I
mean,
mean, Ligma Johnson forever, seriously, right? So, for those of you who don't get that reference, just Google Ligma Johnson, and you will be, you'll be amazed what the mainstream media will believe, as long as it suits their narrative. But fantastic, and Rahul Ligma is an Indian guy, right? You can follow him at zero interest rates. That's zero as in the number zero interest rates. Pretty interesting guy, right? I mean, he's got up to about 8,000 plus followers. I was just checking his timeline, and overall, very funny guy as well. He will be on a couple of podcasts for sure. So I'm really looking forward to his explaining how they came up with this whole prank and everything. But man, that was hilarious.
and also another interesting thing here to notice right now, all of the world's richest people, they own some sort of a media company, right? I mean, Warren Buffett owns
That is
Times.
the template, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at, I don't know whether it's Ambani, Adani, or Carlos Slim, perhaps owns a bunch of stations in Mexico, right? In the US as well, Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, and Elon owns Twitter. So yeah.
All right, and closer home, we had Boat that had filed the DRHCB papers to go IPO sometime this year, and this was way back in January 26. Recently, they withdraw their filing, and instead of raising funds for an IPO, they raised 500 crore rupees from its existing investors. In one of the press releases, it was mentioned that the reason for withdrawing the IPO is that market conditions are choppy, right? And with this, Boat is not the only company that has changed its IPO plans. We had Pharmacy's parent company API Holdings, and then we had Room Technologies, who likewise had withdrawn the DRHCB papers. Now, of course, a major reason for this could be the drop in valuation which we're seeing in today's listed tech companies. There's increased regulatory scrutiny, and of course, the poor investor sentiment, right? And with all this, US is heading into a recession, and we are seeing the other global headwinds which are currently underway. So do you think startups will defer all of their IPO plans for maybe at least a year or two?
I think so. I mean, it seems more or less likely at this point of time, right? I mean, we've talked about the Fed hiking rates in February, which is expected to be again bigger than the last one, right? So obviously, the macro environment is going to be less than ideal. Both plan to raise, I think, about 2,000 crores through IPO. They've raised about 500 crores from their existing investors like Warburg Pincus and so on. It's pretty sad. I mean, that's the way it is. I mean, I think Traction listed, I think a week back, a week or 10 days back, they're down about 15%. So I don't think anyone will take a chance in this kind of a market. And I don't know about Pharmacy and the others. Pharmacy is still bleeding a lot of money. I don't know about Droom specifically, but Boat is profitable, right? I mean, Boat, I think if I remember correctly, their FY21 numbers were around 1,500 crores of revenue and around 75, 80 crores of profit. And so they don't really have to list at this point of time, and so maybe they will wait it out maybe a year or so, right? Probably consider maybe 23 end or maybe 24 to list on the markets. It's an interesting time. Entrepreneurs will have to bide this time through. And boat is such a fantastic story, right? I mean, they started by making, charging cables, and since then have grown to be the consumer internet brand in India,
It's the
right?
second largest. It has the second largest market share for audio devices in the world.
That's
Currently.
amazing. That's just amazing, really. We talk about manufacturing in India and so on. Of course, I mean, boat started with importing stuff from China and then branding it and selling it here. But I mean, since then, I mean, they've pivoted some of their design and manufacturing capabilities to India as well, right? So I'm rooting for them, and their co-founder Aman is a lot of fun to watch on TV as well. So yeah, let's hope for the best.
So not only, I mean, we are seeing headwinds in the public markets, but even the edtech sector is really going through some tough times. We have seen the likes of Byju's laying off people in the hope to optimize and increase their profitability. And last week, employees from the Thiruvananthapuram office of Byju's have alleged that they are being pressurized to resign for more than a week, and the company management has now offered them a transfer option only because the issue was highlighted in the media. Some of these employees had met State Labour Minister V. Sivankutty to seek compensation, following which the company management, which had not issued any official communication to the employees until then, suddenly offered them a transfer option. And apparently, in a screenshot of the email, this transfer option is to the Bangalore offices, where earlier they had fired employees in the past without any communication. Now this is becoming a huge issue, right? Just because the number of people that are being affected by this. And earlier we have had talks of some sort of regulation within the edtech space, but no further update has come from there. How do you think this will pan out in the next few months?
This is going to be a huge problem, right? Obviously, I mean, Byju's, Academy, a bunch of these folks hired people by the truckloads in 2021, and now they're having to realign some of their business, focus on profitability, and these are hard choices, right? Let's face it, it's definitely a hard choice to let go of people. I only hope they do it in a manner that is, amenable and kind to everyone involved. Kerala is obviously a communist government, right? I mean, and famous for unionizing on wide variety of things. I mean, at least this calls for good reason to unionize. So I'd rather that the company leadership takes matters into their hands and does something to solve this than have some kind of a regulation, right? That's always better, I would say. So let's see how this pans out. But yeah, I mean, this is going to be a tough time for edtech, I would say.
Also, last week, there's this interesting phenomenon where the amount of capital which was raised via debt funding was considerably higher than the money raised through VC routes, right? And the venture debt raised by Indian startups stood at $170 million vis-a-vis $114 million raised through VCs. And the debt funds were led by Udan and Northern Arc Capital. One of the major fundraisers was by a seed stage company called Mason that raised a $7.5 million round, and this funding round was led by Axel and Idea Spring Capital along with other investors. Mason allows sellers to have the D2C storefront ready with a 50% uplift in their margins from day one. And this is largely to circumvent the high commissions charged by the likes of Amazon and Flipkart, right? I mean, we are seeing conversations from last week where CCI issued the statement against Google and their malpractices against the Indian developer ecosystem. And now, I mean, at least now the story is being highlighted of companies like Mason that are trying to circumvent Amazon. So what do you make of this?
Yeah, Mason is a very interesting story, right? We had Kaus, who's their co-founder, sometime back on the podcast, and she's been a maker all her life. I mean, she has built application solutions for a while, and what they're trying to do with Mason is basically help shop owners customize their front end. So this could be through the Shopify stores that they have, or whatever else, right? And that has a huge uptick in terms of revenue retention, conversions, and so on, right? And I love that there is this whole enabling ecosystem infrastructure for all of these businesses, right? Whether it is D2C or whoever else on the e-commerce side of things. See, I've said this before that there will be an active Amazon Plus sort of a wave in India for e-commerce, and you're seeing plenty of that, right? I mean, whether it is social commerce with the likes of Dealshare or Meesho and so on, or the whole D2C phenomena itself, where people are marketing their own storefronts, right? So I think people will look beyond marketplaces and probably balance both out, right? I mean, I think a lot of people I know, I mean, do both, right? And it's good that there are all of these plugins, products for these folks to really do well. So if you haven't already, do check out the episode we did with Kaus sometime back. She spoke really well about working with these e-commerce shop owners and solving their problems and so on. So yeah, we'll link to it in the description.
Yeah. And in this conversation, we have not even factored out the effect platforms like ONDC will have, right?
Exactly.
And not only ONDC, the government itself also has been like so proactive in enabling this ecosystem. For example, it was only yesterday I was watching this Think School video on Uttar Pradesh's one district, one product model by Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath. Under this scheme, every district will have one export quality product which is indigenous to that area. The example which was shown in Think School was this whole Kala Namak rice, which is found in one district of UP, and that has a lot of health benefits. Now, under this one district, one product initiative, farmers or the small scale entrepreneurs are gonna get support in terms of tech, in terms of marketing through fairs and trades organizations, which will give a huge boost. And now here we have the startup ecosystem actually providing a storefront for them to directly put on these shops online and sell it directly. I think
it's
that's a huge
fantastic.
enabling factor.
Yeah. See, UP and Bihar, I mean, are two of those states that have massive potential. People are very enterprising, and these are some of the more populous states in the country, right? And if India has to develop, I think UP and Bihar and the adjoining states have to develop. And the Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath has done a fantastic job in developing infrastructure and bringing out these schemes as well. So let's hope that there's more business and more economic development comes out of these regions.
Yeah. And in other fundraise announcements, we have Kinara Capital, which is a fintech lender, has raised close to $24 million from British International Investment, Newvin, and the ASN Microcredit Fund. Deftron, which is a Gurgaon headquartered open source DevOps platform, has raised $12 million from Insight Partners, Leo Capital, and angel investors. And cybersecurity startup Blue Sapphire Cyber Systems has raised $9.2 million from Bearings India, Dallas Venture Capitals, and others. Now, while of course in Twitter there has been multiple, number of trending topics out there, but to touch base from last week, Snehal Khanor, who is the co-founder and CEO of Truly Madly and someone we have had in the podcast earlier, put out a very interesting tweet comparing CCI's judgment to Govardhan Puja. His tweet reads, CCI just saved India from getting trapped under digital colonialism. On the auspicious day of Govardhan Puja, much like how Lord Krishna lifted Govardhan Parvat to save the entire village from heavy rainfall bestowed upon them by arrogant Lord Indra. That's some analogy. But yeah, while the CCI has announced its verdict and imposed the fines on Google, what remains to be seen is how much Google acts on it. Because we have seen in other countries that they have a way of getting around rules.
Yeah, I mean, they will obviously fight it tooth and nail. And interestingly, Aviral Bhatnagar had said, this is probably they will budget it as cost of acquisition. But it's good. It's good. I mean, I think CCI should definitely get its act together. Has got its act together, and should impose some kind of penalties on the arbitrary actions of some of these folks, right? Whether it's Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and so on. Certainly, I mean, we have the heft right now. I mean, we have 600 million internet users, perhaps the largest developer ecosystem in the world. So we should have better negotiating chips, right? I mean, we should sit at the table and negotiate with these folks, and that's really what I think some of the policy folks have realized, right? Why are we beholden to some company based out of the Cayman Island or Ireland or whatever that is making these arbitrary kind of rules, right? Yeah, I mean, I really hope that some more sense prevails and we solve this through innovation rather than regulation. But if not that, I mean, they should definitely be drawn to the table by one way or another.
In the podcast, we have had many founders who have come and they've actively voiced their concerns over Google's practices, right? I think we should get some comments from them. And folks, I mean, if you also want to join this conversation, do tag us. Our Twitter handle is at Operator Startup. Roshan, now before we end this episode, why don't you take us through some of the conversations you have lined up for this week?
A couple of very interesting episodes coming up this week. Last week we wanted to put out this episode with Varun Khurana, who is the co-founder of Crow Farm. Some of you may know their consumer service called OTP. They basically make this fresh produce demand driven. They're working with farmers, FPOs, farmer produce organizations, and so on to optimize their entire supply chain through predictive algorithms and all of those kinds of innovations. I spoke to him about building in this whole agri-tech space, what it takes, and he's a serial entrepreneur as well, and he had a lot of good wisdom to share on that. Certainly some kind of a primer on how to operate in the agri-tech space, and you can learn from it even otherwise. So yeah, look out for that episode. Then we have one of the most successful SaaS entrepreneurs in the ecosystem, Anand Jain, who runs CleverTap, right? He's a co-founder of CleverTap. CleverTap is almost tending towards, I think, $100 million ARR right now, which which is a phenomenal achievement. And I would love to understand, more about what are the kind of playbooks, right? I mean, how do you go from 0 to 1 to 10 to 25 to 100? Certainly will be interesting to talk to him about those aspects, how to hire, how to enable various aspects of product marketing and so on, right? So very interesting conversations lined up. Let us know if you think that we should host any particular founder or operator on the podcast. I'd love to, get them on the podcast.
Well, yeah, and you can let us know your questions through LinkedIn or Twitter. On LinkedIn, we are the Startup Operator, and on Twitter, it's at Operator Startup. Apart from that, folks, if you enjoyed this conversation, do rate us on your favorite podcast platform app, as that will help our visibility increase and more people like you will be able to discover our content. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and we'll be back with more updates from the Indian startup ecosystem next week. Have a great week and see you again.
See you guys.